The television cast its blue glow across the living room like moonlight through water, illuminating two controllers and four hands that had held them countless times before. The familiar weight of plastic and buttons felt different tonight, though I couldn't yet name why. Julian sat beside me on his worn leather couch, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the lingering warmth of coffee. We had been playing for hours, our characters locked in digital battles that required no conversation, only the comfortable rhythm of shared focus that had defined our friendship for nearly 2 decades. I was 37 years old, and I thought I knew myself completely. I was Nathaniel Morrison, husband to Clara, father to 2 boys who looked at me like I had answers to questions I was still learning to ask. I was the man who left the house each morning with a travel mug and a pressed shirt, who returned each evening to homework supervision and dinner discussions about soccer practice schedules. I was reliable, predictable, safe. The kind of man who kept his life in neat compartments, each responsibility labeled and filed away. But sitting there in Julian's apartment, watching our avatars navigate some post-apocalyptic landscape, I felt something stirring beneath the surface of that carefully constructed identity. It was like recognizing a song you had forgotten you knew, the melody surfacing unexpectedly after years of silence. Julian paused the game without warning. The sudden quiet felt enormous, as if all the sound in the world had been compressed into the soft hum of the television and the distant murmur of traffic outside his window. His thumb remained poised over the controller, but his attention had shifted entirely. I could feel him looking at me, though I kept my eyes fixed on the frozen screen where our characters stood suspended mid-motion, weapons raised against enemies that would wait patiently for us to resume their destruction. I had known Julian since we were 18, since freshman orientation at a college we both barely graduated from. We had been roommates, study partners, best men at each other's important moments. He knew me before I learned to tie a tie properly, before I understood what it meant to love someone enough to promise them forever. He had been a constant in every version of myself I had tried on over the years, the one person who never seemed surprised by any choice I made, as if he could see some pattern in my life that remained invisible to me. The apartment around us held the evidence of a different kind of life than mine. No family photos clustered on side tables, no children's artwork magnet to the refrigerator, no shared calendar marking soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. Julian lived alone, had always lived alone, and his space reflected that solitude in ways both liberating and melancholy. Books stacked beside the couch, a single coffee cup on the table, a silence that belonged entirely to him. When I visited, which I did perhaps more often than a married man with 2 children should, I felt like I was stepping into an alternate version of my own existence. He turned his head toward me, and I finally allowed myself to meet his gaze. In the television's flickering light, his face looked different somehow, as if I were seeing it through new eyes. The same dark hair that had grown slightly gray at the temples, the same brown eyes that had watched me stumble through failed exams and successful job interviews and the awkward early months of my marriage. But tonight, something in his expression held me still, made me conscious of my own breathing, of the space between our bodies on the couch, of the way the silence had transformed from comfortable to charged. Julian had always been beautiful in a way I had trained myself not to notice. Not handsome in the conventional sense that drew stares from strangers, but beautiful in the way that certain landscapes are beautiful, quietly, persistently, until suddenly you realize you have been looking at something extraordinary all along. His beauty lived in gestures, the way he laughed with his whole body, the careful attention he paid to conversations, the ease with which he moved through the world, unencumbered by the weight of others' expectations. I had spent years explaining our friendship to Clara, defending the time I spent here, the late-night phone calls, the way Julian's presence could shift my mood from frustrated to content in the space of shared joke. She tolerated it with the patience of someone who recognized a losing battle, though I sometimes caught her studying us when we were together, as if trying to solve an equation she couldn't quite balance. The controller grew heavy in my hands. On the screen, Our characters waited for us to remember we were playing a game, that this was supposed to be simple entertainment, a way to pass time until the evening dissolved into separate lives and separate beds. But time felt suspended now, held in the moment between Julian's pause and whatever came next. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the exact temperature of the air between us, could sense something approaching that would change the careful architecture of our friendship forever. Julian set his controller down on the coffee table with deliberate care, the small sound loud in the stillness. His movement was slow, considered, like someone handling something precious and breakable. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, intimate in a way that made the large room feel suddenly small. He said my name, just my name, but in a tone I had never heard from him before, as if he were testing the weight of it, measuring how it sounded in this new silence we had created. The syllables hung in the air between us, and I understood with sudden clarity that we had arrived at a moment that had been building for years without my conscious awareness, like a song playing just below the range of hearing until finally the volume was turned up enough to recognize the melody. I should have laughed, should have asked what was wrong, should have picked up my controller and resumed our game, restoring the comfortable distance of shared activity. Instead, I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was crystallizing in the space between us. My throat felt dry, my hands unsteady, as if my body had recognized something my mind was still trying to deny. The truth settled over me with a weight of recognition. This feeling, this awareness, this sudden hyper-conscious attention to Julian's presence beside me. It was not new. It had been there all along, patient and persistent, waiting for a moment when my defenses were low enough, my attention focused enough to finally surface. All those years of friendship, all those nights of easy companionship, had been building toward this instant of seeing clearly what had always been there. Julian was still looking at me, waiting, and I realized that he was giving me time to catch up to something he had perhaps understood long before I did. The patience in his expression suggested this was not a sudden revelation for him, that he had been living with this knowledge, carrying it quietly while I remained oblivious. The thought should have frightened me, but instead it felt like relief, like finally being allowed to stop pretending not to see what was directly in front of me. The game continued to wait, our digital selves frozen in their eternal battle, while something infinitely more complex and dangerous began in the silence of Julian's living room. The drive home from Julian's apartment took me through streets I had traveled thousands of times, past the elementary school where my sons learned fractions and state capitals, past the grocery store where Clara and I argued quietly about organic produce and household budgets. The familiar landmarks felt strange now, as if I were seeing them through glass, removed from the life they represented. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and I found myself driving slower than usual, reluctant to reach the end of the journey. Our house sat in the middle of a cul-de-sac, identical to its neighbors except for the small details that marked it as ours. Clara's carefully tended flower beds, the basketball hoop I had installed last spring, the welcome mat she replaced seasonally. It was a good house, the kind of house that suggested stability and success to anyone driving past. Inside, it held the accumulated evidence of a family life I had built piece by piece over 14 years of marriage. The hallway walls displayed our progression in carefully framed photographs. Our wedding day, where Clara looked radiant and I looked young and certain. Hospital pictures with each newborn son. Vacation shots from beaches and amusement parks where we all smiled on command. Looking at them now, I felt like I was studying the life of a stranger who happened to share my face. The man in those photographs seemed so sure of himself, so comfortable in his role as husband and father. I could barely remember feeling that certainty. Clara was already asleep when I slipped into our bedroom, her breathing steady and familiar. She lay on her side, dark hair spread across the pillow, one hand resting where my pillow should have been. 15 years ago, the sight of her sleeping would have filled me with tenderness, with the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. Now I felt like an intruder in my own life, careful not to disturb the bed as I changed into pajamas and tried to arrange myself beside her without waking her. Sleep eluded me. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling, to the distant hum of the refrigerator, to Clara's breathing beside me. My mind kept returning to Julian's apartment, to the moment when he had said my name and everything had shifted. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just fatigue and imagination, but the feeling persisted like a song stuck in my head. Morning arrived with the usual chaos: alarm clocks and breakfast negotiations, and the search for missing homework and soccer cleats. I moved through the routine automatically, packing lunches and signing permission slips, but I felt disconnected from it all, as if I were watching someone else live my life. Clara noticed my distraction over coffee, her green eyes studying me with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle shifts in a spouse's mood. She asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired. The lie came easily, smoothly, but left a bitter taste that lingered long after she had driven away with the boys. At work, I sat in meetings about quarterly projections and departmental restructuring, contributing when expected, but unable to focus completely on any conversation. My colleagues saw the same Nathaniel they had always seen: reliable, competent, occasionally funny. But inside, I felt like I was coming apart at the seams, questioning every assumption I had made about myself and my life. Julian had always been the exception to the careful order I had built around myself. Our friendship existed outside the boundaries of my marriage, my work, my responsibilities as a father. It was the one space where I could be the person I had been before I learned to be the person everyone expected me to be. When we were together, I laughed more easily, spoke more honestly, felt more alive in ways I had trained myself not to examine too closely. We had grown up together in a different time, when friendship between men was simpler, less scrutinized. We had shared rooms and secrets and dreams, had supported each other through heartbreaks and failures and small victories. Julian knew me before I met Clara, before I learned what it meant to be responsible for other people's happiness. He remembered the version of myself I had been at 18, 19, 20, uncertain and searching and open to possibilities I could no longer name. While I had chosen marriage and children and the suburban life that came with them, Julian had remained single, unattached, free to make decisions based on his own desires rather than the needs of a family. His apartment reflected that freedom. Books chosen for pleasure rather than improvement, furniture selected for comfort rather than practicality, a silence that belonged entirely to him. When I visited, which I did perhaps once a week under the guise of maintaining our friendship, I felt like I was stepping into an alternate version of my own existence. Clara had never quite understood our relationship, though she tolerated it with the patience of someone who recognized a losing battle. She knew that Julian had been my roommate in college, that we had maintained our friendship through my marriage and the birth of my children, that I valued his opinion on everything from movies to career decisions. What she couldn't understand was the way I seemed to come alive in his presence, the way conversations with him energized me in ways that conversations with her no longer did. I had spent years explaining it to her, defending the time I spent with him, the late-night phone calls, the way his presence could shift my mood from frustrated to content in the space of shared joke. But my explanations felt hollow, even to me, as if I were describing something I didn't fully understand myself. Now, sitting in my office and staring out the window at the parking lot where my sensible sedan sat among rows of other sensible sedans, I began to suspect that my inability to explain our friendship had less to do with Clara's understanding and more to do with my own willful blindness. Some truths I was beginning to realize require a readiness that can take decades to develop. The call came on a Friday evening while I was helping Tommy with his math homework, fractions spread across the kitchen table like small puzzles waiting to be solved. Clara was upstairs running a bath for herself, the sound of water filling the tub mixing with the distant hum of the dishwasher. It was the kind of domestic scene that had once felt like contentment, but now seemed to highlight the careful choreography required to maintain our family's daily rhythm. Julian's name appeared on my phone screen, and I felt something tighten in my chest. We hadn't spoken since that night on his couch, since the moment when everything had shifted and I had driven home feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Part of me had hoped the feeling would fade, that distance would restore the comfortable boundaries of our friendship. Instead, the opposite had happened. His absence had only made me more conscious of how much space he occupied in my thoughts. He asked if I wanted to come over for a gaming night, just like old times. His voice sounded carefully casual, as if he too were testing whether we could return to the easy rhythm of our friendship. I found myself agreeing before I had fully considered the implications, driven by a hunger I didn't want to examine too closely. Clara emerged from the bathroom as I was ending the call, her hair wrapped in a towel, her face flushed from the heat of her bath. She looked tired in the way that mothers of young children always look tired, a weariness that lives in the bones and can't be erased by a single evening of rest. When I told her about Julian's invitation, something flickered across her expression, not quite disapproval, but a recognition that carried years of accumulated tension. She told me to go, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to pick her battles carefully. But there was an edge to her encouragement, the subtle resentment of someone who had long noticed how animated I became at the prospect of spending time with Julian. She had seen me brighten at his phone calls, had watched me prepare for our evenings together with more attention than I gave to most other aspects of my life. I wondered sometimes if she understood something about our friendship that I was still refusing to see. The drive to Julian's apartment felt different this time, charged with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. I found myself paying attention to details I usually ignored. The way the streetlights cast shadows through my windshield, the familiar landmarks that marked the transition from my neighborhood to his, the moment when suburban order gave way to the more eclectic architecture of his part of town. His building stood among a row of converted warehouses, all exposed brick and large windows that suggested lives less constrained by conventional expectations. I had always envied the freedom implied by his address, the way it suggested someone who had chosen his surroundings based on preference rather than practicality, someone who answered only to himself. Julian met me at the door with a smile that seemed both welcoming and uncertain, as if he too was unsure how to navigate whatever had changed between us. His apartment looked the same as always. Comfortable chaos, books stacked beside the couch, the large television that had hosted countless hours of our shared escapes into digital worlds. But the atmosphere felt different now, charged with an awareness that hadn't existed before. We settled into our usual positions on his leather couch, controllers in hand, the familiar weight of plastic and buttons feeling both comforting and strange. The game loaded with its usual array of explosions and dramatic music, but I found myself more conscious of Julian's presence beside me than of the action on screen. The space between us on the couch felt both too large and too small, as if some invisible boundary had been redrawn and neither of us was sure where the new lines fell. For the first hour, we managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. We joked about the game's ridiculous plot, strategized about weapon choices, fell into the comfortable rhythm of cooperation that had characterized our friendship for years. But underneath the familiar banter, I could feel something else building, a tension that had nothing to do with digital battles and everything to do with the unspoken question that hung between us. The silences between levels felt heavier than they used to, filled with words neither of us was ready to speak. I caught Julian glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and I realized I was doing the same thing, stealing glimpses of his profile in the television's flickering light. The casual contact that had always been part of our friendship, shoulders brushing when we leaned forward, hands accidentally touching when we reached for drinks, now felt electric, weighted with significance I couldn't ignore. When Julian paused the game mid-level, I felt my heart rate quicken. The silence expanded around us, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. He set his controller aside with the same deliberate care he had used the week before, and I knew we had arrived at another threshold moment. Another point where our friendship would either return to its familiar boundaries or transform into something entirely different. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, more intimate, as if the walls had moved closer while we weren't paying attention. The city hummed quietly outside his windows, but inside, The only sound was our breathing and the soft, electronic hum of the paused game. Julian turned toward me, and I found myself mirroring his movement without conscious decision, drawn by a magnetism I could no longer pretend not to feel. This time, I didn't look away. The pause stretched between us like a held breath, and when Julian finally resumed the game, something fundamental had shifted in the air we shared. We finished the level in relative silence, our usual commentary replaced by an awareness that hummed just beneath the surface of our interactions. When I left his apartment that night, the goodbye felt weighted with unfinished business, as if we had started a conversation that would continue whether we spoke the words aloud or not. Back home, I found Clara already asleep, her book fallen open across her chest, reading glasses askew on her face. I moved carefully in the darkness, removing her glasses and closing the book, my familiar caretaking gestures feeling automatic and distant. She stirred slightly as I settled beside her, murmuring something unintelligible before returning to sleep. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the evening, searching for meaning in silences and stolen glances. Morning brought no relief from the restlessness that had taken root in my chest. I went through the motions of breakfast and goodbyes, kissing Clara's cheek and ruffling the boys' hair before they disappeared into their separate days. But even these routine gestures felt strange, as if I were performing them from a great distance, watching myself play the role of husband and father while something else entirely occupied my thoughts. At work, I found myself distracted during meetings, my attention drifting to my phone whenever it buzzed with notifications. Each time Julian's name appeared on the screen, my pulse quickened in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. His messages were innocuous, links to articles he thought I might find interesting, jokes about the game we had been playing, casual observations about his day. But I found myself reading each one multiple times, searching for subtext in every word choice, every emoji, every pause between messages. Clara noticed my distraction over dinner that week. She asked if everything was all right at work, if I was worried about something. I assured her that everything was fine, that I was just tired, that the project I was managing was more complex than usual. The lies came easily now, practiced and smooth, but they left me feeling hollow, as if each deception carved out a little more space between who I was and who I was pretending to be. The next time Julian and I met, ostensibly for another gaming session, the ease that had always characterized our friendship felt fragile, held together by mutual pretense. We talked about everything except what was happening between us, but the unspoken truth colored every interaction. When he handed me a drink, our fingers brushed for a moment longer than necessary. When we sat on his couch, the space between us felt both too large and too small, a careful distance maintained through conscious effort rather than natural comfort. I began to notice things about Julian that I had somehow overlooked for years. The way he laughed with his whole body, throwing his head back with genuine delight. The careful attention he paid to everything I said, as if my words carried more weight than they deserved. The grace with which he moved through his apartment, comfortable in his own space in a way that I envied. These observations accumulated like evidence of something I wasn't ready to name, building a case for feelings I had spent decades ignoring. Our conversations began to drift into more personal territory, though we both maintained the illusion that we were simply catching up, two old friends sharing the details of their lives. Julian told me about a book he was reading, about a trip he was planning, about his thoughts on aging and solitude and the choices that define a life. I found myself hanging on his every word, storing away these glimpses into his inner world like treasures I could examine later in private. When I spoke, it was with an honesty that surprised me. I told him about feeling trapped in routines that no longer brought me joy, about the way family life sometimes felt like an elaborate performance I had forgotten how to exit. I confessed to dreams I had abandoned, to a sense that I was living someone else's idea of what my life should look like. Julian listened without judgment, his brown eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me feel both exposed and understood. The transformation was subtle but persistent, like a tide that changes the shoreline, so gradually you don't notice until you look back and realize nothing is where it used to be. I began to dread leaving Julian's apartment, prolonging our evenings with unnecessary conversations, finding excuses to linger in his doorway. At home, I felt like a visitor in my own life, going through familiar motions while part of me remained elsewhere, replaying moments and conversations, anticipating the next opportunity to feel fully present in my own skin. Clara's questions became more pointed. She asked why I'd been so distant lately, why I seemed to be somewhere else even when I was sitting right beside her. She wondered aloud if our marriage was in trouble, if there was something I needed to tell her. Each question felt like an invitation to confession, but I wasn't ready to speak truths I was still learning to recognize. Instead, I offered reassurances I wasn't sure I believed, promises to be more present, to pay more attention to the life we had built together. But even as I made these promises, I knew something irreversible was happening. The careful compartments of my existence were beginning to blur, and the man I had been for 37 years was slowly giving way to someone I didn't yet fully understand. Julian had become both the catalyst and the destination of this transformation, the friend who had always seen me clearly and the person who might help me see myself. The confession came on a Thursday night when exhaustion had worn away the careful barriers I had spent weeks constructing. We had been playing for hours, our characters navigating some sprawling fantasy world that felt more real to me than my own life. The apartment was warm, lit only by the television's glow and a single lamp in the corner that cast everything in amber shadows. Julian sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that every small movement seemed magnified. I've been thinking about identity all week, about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we're supposed to be. At home, I moved through my days like an actor who had forgotten his lines, fumbling through scenes that had once felt natural. Clara watched me with increasing concern, her questions growing more direct, more pointed. The boys seemed to sense my distraction, becoming more demanding of my attention, as if they could restore my presence through sheer persistence. But here, in Julian's living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived according to internal compass rather than external expectations, I felt the weight of pretense becoming unbearable. The game paused between levels, and instead of the usual commentary about strategy or storyline, I found myself speaking words I hadn't planned to say. Sometimes I don't know who I am anymore, I told him, my voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and undeniable. I had expected Julian to laugh, to make a joke that would restore the comfortable distance we had been maintaining. Instead, he set his controller aside and turned to face me fully, his expression serious in a way that made my heart beat faster. The television hummed quietly in the background, its screen frozen on a landscape of digital mountains and impossible skies. But neither of us looked at it. Julian's eyes held mine with an intensity that felt like confession, like prayer, like the moment before stepping off a cliff into unknown air. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of truths finally being acknowledged, of the end of a long pretense neither of us had been willing to name. "Maybe you've always known," Julian said, his voice low and careful. "You just didn't want to see it." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood about myself. His honesty was both gentle and devastating, delivered with the patience of someone who had been waiting years for me to catch up to something he had recognized long before I did. The air between us thickened, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear the sound of my own breathing amplified in the sudden quiet. Julian shifted closer, not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of movement that could be accidental if either of us needed to pretend it was. The space between us on the couch shrank to inches, and I found myself cataloging details I had somehow missed before. The way his hair fell across his forehead, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident I remembered witnessing, the warmth in his eyes that had always made me feel understood. When Julian's hand moved toward mine, The gestures seemed to happen in slow motion. I watched his fingers approach, felt the moment of contact like electricity, like coming home, like waking up from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. His touch was light, tentative, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to restore the safe distance we had been maintaining. Instead, I found myself turning my palm upward, our fingers interlacing with a naturalness that felt both shocking and inevitable. The relief was overwhelming. For weeks, I had been carrying the weight of unspoken feelings, unacknowledged desires, questions I had been afraid to ask myself. Now, with Julian's hand in mine, the truth settled over me like a long-held breath finally being released. This was not imagination. This was not confusion or midlife crisis or any of the explanations I had tried to construct. This was recognition of something that had always been there, patient and persistent, waiting for me to stop running from it. The terror came just as quickly as the relief. Because if this was real, if what I was feeling was true, then everything else in my life was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath my feet. My marriage, my identity as a father, my place in the careful suburban community where I had made my home, all of it suddenly felt like costume I had been wearing so long, I had forgotten it wasn't my skin. Julian seemed to understand the war happening inside me without me having to explain it. He didn't push for words or declarations or promises I wasn't ready to make. Instead, he simply held my hand and waited, giving me space to absorb what was happening, to process the magnitude of what we had just acknowledged between us. I realized I was crying, tears I hadn't felt coming now, streaming down my face. Julian reached up with his free hand and wiped them away with such tenderness that I felt something break open inside my chest. The gesture was intimate in a way that went beyond physical contact, carrying years of friendship and understanding, and now this new awareness that changed everything. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. We sat in the lamplight, hands joined, while the game waited patiently for our return and the city hummed quietly outside the windows. I had spent so many years believing I knew exactly who I was, what I wanted, where I belonged. Now, at 37, I was discovering that identity could shift like sand, that desire could emerge from depths you never knew existed, that love could take forms you had never allowed yourself to imagine. The days that followed felt like living in a house of cards, each movement threatening to bring everything crashing down. I carried the memory of Julian's touch like a secret written on my skin, invisible to everyone else, but burning under my clothes. At breakfast, I found myself staring at my wedding ring while Clara discussed soccer practice schedules and parent-teacher conferences, her voice seeming to come from very far away. The gold band felt heavier than it had in years, a physical reminder of promises made by a younger man who thought he understood himself completely. Clara's intuition had always been sharper than my ability to hide. She began asking questions that felt less like casual conversation and more like gentle interrogation. She wondered why I seemed distracted during family dinners, why I stared at my phone with such intensity, why I had started taking longer routes home from work. Her green eyes studied me across the breakfast table with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. When she asked directly if there was something I needed to tell her, the words caught in my throat like broken glass. How could I explain that I was discovering parts of myself I had never known existed? How could I tell her that the man she had married was becoming a stranger even to himself? Instead, I offered weak reassurances that everything was fine, that work was stressful, that I was simply tired. The lies tasted bitter, but the truth felt impossible to speak. At night, I lay awake beside her listening to her steady breathing while my mind raced through possibilities and consequences. In the darkness, I allowed myself to imagine different choices, different lives, different versions of courage. But morning always arrived with its demands and responsibilities, pulling me back into the performance of being the man everyone expected me to be. Julian became both refuge and danger, the only place where I could breathe freely, and the person who made normal breathing impossible. Our friendship had transformed into something charged and fragile, held together by unspoken understanding and the memory of his hand in mine. When we met, which was less frequently now under Clara's watchful eyes, we moved around each other like dancers learning a new rhythm, careful not to step too close to the fire we had lit between us. The weight of pretending began to show in ways I couldn't control. I caught myself staring at nothing during important meetings, my mind drifting to conversations with Julian that had happened days before. I forgot appointments, misplaced documents, found myself standing in rooms without remembering why I had entered them. The careful order of my life was unraveling thread by thread, and I seemed powerless to stop it. One evening, while helping Tommy with his homework, he looked up at me with his mother's perceptive eyes and asked if I was sad about something. The question, delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that children possess, nearly broke what remained of my composure. I assured him that I was fine, that grown-ups sometimes had complicated thoughts, that he shouldn't worry. But his concern lingered in his expression, and I realized that my internal struggle was becoming visible even to my 8-year-old son. The choice began to feel less like a decision and more like an inevitability rushing toward me. I could continue this careful balancing act, living divided between the life I had built and the feelings I could no longer deny. Or I could step into the unknown with Julian, accepting that such a step would shatter everything stable and familiar in my world. Both options felt impossible, but staying suspended between them was becoming unbearable. The night Julian called to ask if I wanted to come over, Clara was loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary, the plates clattering against each other in a way that suggested barely contained frustration. She had stopped encouraging my visits to Julian's apartment, her tolerance finally worn thin by weeks of my distraction and emotional absence. When I told her about his invitation, she turned to face me fully, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She asked, with quiet directness, if I was having an affair. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation and an invitation to honesty. I told her no, which was technically true, but felt like the worst kind of deception. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded and returned to her dishes, but something in her posture suggested she didn't believe me entirely. The drive to Julian's apartment felt like traveling toward a precipice I couldn't turn away from. My hand shook slightly on the steering wheel, and I found myself taking deep breaths to steady my nerves. The familiar streets looked different somehow, as if the landscape itself was shifting to accommodate the changes happening inside me. Julian met me at the door with an expression that mirrored my own mix of anticipation and apprehension. His apartment felt smaller that night, more intimate, as if the walls had moved closer to accommodate the conversation we both knew was coming. We went through the motions of setting up the game, but neither of us was really interested in playing. The controllers sat and used on the coffee table while we faced each other on the couch, the space between us electric with unspoken words. The game ran, characters waiting patiently for commands that never came. Julian looked at me with eyes that held years of friendship and this new awareness that had transformed everything between us. When he spoke, his voice was steady but gentle, carrying the weight of someone who had been patient long enough. "You can't keep pretending, Nate," he said, and the words landed like stones thrown into still water. The truth in them was undeniable, inescapable, final. I felt something shift inside me, a door opening or closing, a choice being made whether I was ready or not. Julian's words echoed in the silence that followed, reverberating through the apartment like ripples in still water. "You can't keep pretending, Nate." The truth of it settled into my bones with a weight that felt both crushing and liberating. I looked at him sitting across from me, this man who had known me longer than almost anyone, who had watched me construct the careful architecture of a life that was suddenly revealing itself as a beautiful prison. I left his apartment that night without giving him an answer, though we both understood that silence was its own kind of response. The drive home felt endless, each familiar street a reminder of the life waiting for me, the responsibilities and expectations that had shaped my days for so many years. The house was dark when I arrived, Clara and the boys already asleep, their dreams undisturbed by the earthquake happening in the front seat of our family sedan. Inside, the house felt like a museum of someone else's existence. Family photographs lined the hallway, frozen moments of happiness that belonged to people I could barely remember being. The wedding picture near the staircase showed a younger version of myself, arm around Clara's waist, both of us grinning with the confidence of people who believe they had figured out how to be happy forever. I stared at that image for a long time, trying to recall what that certainty had felt like when love seemed simple and choices seemed clear. The living room was exactly as I had left it, controllers on a coffee table. The same game Julian and I had been playing still paused on the screen. Our digital characters stood frozen mid-battle, weapons raised against enemies that would wait forever for us to resume their destruction. There was something profound in their infinite patience, in the way they held their positions while the real world shifted around them. I sat on the couch where I had played countless games with my sons, where Clara and I had watched movies and discussed household budgets and planned family vacations to places that would photograph well for social media. The cushions held the impressions of ordinary evenings, the accumulated weight of a family's daily rituals. But tonight, it felt like sitting in a space that belonged to someone else, a life I had inherited rather than chosen. My wedding ring caught the light from the paused game, a thin band of gold that had once felt like a symbol of love and commitment, but now felt like evidence of a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I twisted it around my finger, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the day Clara had slipped onto my hand while our friends and family watched and applauded our certainty. Upstairs, I could hear the soft sounds of the house settling, the whisper of central air moving through vents, the distant hum of Clara's white noise machine that helped her sleep. These were the sounds of the life I had built, the comfortable rhythms of suburban contentment that had once felt like everything I wanted. Now they seemed to emphasize the careful distance I had been maintaining from my own existence, the way I had learned to live as a visitor in my own home. The coffee table held the detritus of family life. Homework assignments waiting to be checked, bills to be paid, a magazine Clara had been reading about organizing closets and improving communication in marriage. The irony of that last item wasn't lost on me. We had been failing to communicate about the most fundamental things for months, perhaps years, dancing around truths neither of us was ready to speak aloud. My phone buzzed against the silence, Julian's name appearing on the screen with a message that contained only 3 words. "Are you okay?" I stared at the question, feeling its weight, its concern, its implicit understanding that okay was no longer a simple concept in my life. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but no response seemed adequate. How could I explain that I was simultaneously more and less okay than I had been in years, that discovering truth about myself had been both the most liberating and most terrifying experience of my adult life? Instead of responding, I set the phone aside and leaned back into the couch, letting my eyes drift to the paused game screen. The characters waited with infinite patience, suspended in a moment of action that would resume only when someone decided to press play. The metaphor felt heavy-handed but apparent. My own life felt similarly suspended, caught between one story ending and another beginning, waiting for someone to make a choice about what happened next. Clara's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. She appeared in the doorway wearing the old t-shirt she slept in, her hair messed from the pillow, squinting in the blue light of the television. She asked if I was coming to bed, her voice soft with sleep, but carrying an undertone of something I couldn't quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or resignation. I told her I would be up in a few minutes, that I just needed to think about something. She nodded and disappeared back up the stairs, but her presence lingered in the room like a question I wasn't ready to answer. 20 minutes later, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, slipped into bed beside the woman I had loved for 15 years, and lay awake until dawn thinking about the difference between the life you build and the life that builds itself inside you while you're not paying attention. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain and fragile, shaped by choices I was only beginning to understand I would have to make. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine it not as an extension of the past, but as something entirely new, even if it cost me everything I'd spent decades believing I wanted.